what do the skeptics think that the first century eyewitness accounts from the apostles and disciples brought to them? Because it certainly, as we know, it wasn't fame, it wasn't fortune and wealth. It brought them nothing but famine, brought them nothing by imprisonment, persecution, and finally death. Do you find this argument, when skeptics are attacking historical reliability of the Gospels by imposing some supposedly conspiracy that the apostles wanted to, invent all these things, but we know that it did not turn out well to be for the apostles.
Sure. And so I think this is where, like, I would say William Paley's trilemma comes into effect, where um, up to this point, what I've argued is that the Gospels and Acts go back to what the original eyewitnesses were claiming. Well, what were they claiming according to the Gospels and Acts? That Jesus, it wasn't just some fuzzy Jesus that they saw for a few seconds and could have been easily mistaken about seeing, like some sort of grief hallucination or something like that. No, it was somebody that they ate with. It was somebody that they had meals with. It was somebody that they touched aside. And, there was group appearances. They met in the day. They met behind closed doors. They met in outside. There was conversations. This is over a period of 40 days, according to Luke. That's not something you could be easily mistaken about. And so I think lies is actually your best option, because if these do go back to what the eyewitnesses claim, this is what they claimed, that this is what they saw. But you're right. It doesn't make any sense for them to make these claims before a hostile audience. It doesn't make any sense, And so I think this is why I think skeptics get this. This is why they try and separate the Gospels and go, no, 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 no. Like, all you got is Paul, and 1 Corinthians 15 is just a creed that tells us about appearances, and there's no details to those appearances. Look, those could be anything. People see weird stuff and claim to see weird stuff all the time, and they're mistaken all the time. I don't think they want to attribute lies, because I think they know that the apostles were probably, for the most part, sincere. They definitely would say that Paul was sincere. I think that most of them believe that Peter was very sincere. And so, if you can defend Acts, then you can defend the apostles' willingness to suffer alongside, with that. So yeah, I think it's an important point. Also, if Luke was a traveling companion with Paul, then there's two things. One, he was also willing to suffer, because he's traveling with a guy that's constantly getting chased from town to town. And then two, Luke gives us details about what Paul's conversion was like, his blindness for a period of time, his companions hearing a voice, the different sensory details that are involved there. And he also tells us what the apostles were preaching, which was a physically raised Jesus. So it's doubtful that Paul's message and Luke's message are different if they're traveling companions. And it's obvious that they were doing this in front of a hostile audience. So I think lies is just completely improbable, because they gained absolutely nothing. And you just have to be incredibly cynical. Again, you're paying the intellectual price, as I mentioned earlier, at that point. If that's what you're willing to resort to, is it's more likely that they were lying and willing to get themselves, basically chased from town to town and beaten, and undergo labors and dangers and sufferings and even martyrdom in some cases, for just something that they didn't sincerely believe at all. That just stretches credulity. I think a miracle is a far better explanation than that. And if that's what your philosophy leads you to push you towards, then the problem to me is with your philosophy at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, if I was one of the apostles back then, I surely would not want to write embarrassing details about myself, denying Jesus, being told by Jesus, "Get behind me, Satan," being aggressive when, cutting someone's ear, and then Jesus trying me to calm down, or pointing out that females were the first eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, because as we know, in that time, in that culture, women's testimony, especially in the court of law, was not very valid. I would not come up with so many things. I would not put that some of the disciples did not want to believe that Jesus came back to life. and so on and so on and so on. I know that I wouldn't, if I was about to invent with my friends or with my partners, if I was about to invent some story, I would try to make myself look better. And disciples, most of them, in different situations throughout the gospel, they fail. So this is, I think, a huge bonus, a huge evidence for Christianity and for the gospels, that because of these embarrassing details, they portray and depict a true story.
Yeah, I would say embarrassment does count as some evidence for reliability for sure. Again, everything that we've said here, somebody could say, well, these are just kind of small chips, you know. But the thing is if you just keep adding chip after chip after chip, pretty soon you have a pretty big pile. And I think a lot of times this is where skeptics get confused, is they think like in order to have a strong case for Christianity, you need just this one knockdown piece of evidence that just overwhelms the prior probability of a miracle, which is low. You know, it's okay to admit that to a certain extent. I wouldn't, anyway, that's a whole other discussion. I don't think that the prior to a miracle is really that low, but regardless, it's lower than a mundane claim, obviously. So, but the point, what I'm trying to say is that with little pieces, if you put enough little pieces together, they can equal one large, impressive piece. And you think about the way that even we do court cases, a lot of times it's the circumstantial little things that cause one to convict, right? And so yeah, I would say that embarrassing details, like you mentioned there, particularly the women being discoverers of the empty tomb, there's pushback that skeptics can give on that can be somewhat reasonable. There's a lot of embarrassing details, like you mentioned, though. Generally, you don't try and make the leader of your group look like a doofus, the way that they do with Peter. And that's also an interesting point, too, with Peter, the embarrassing details. Peter has a real foot and mouth syndrome. And you see that consistent portrayal in the Gospels over and over and over again, no matter which gospel that it is. I think that this character portrayal of Peter, again, is more probable that this is eyewitness testimony than these are a bunch of embellished stories, because you see this very consistent picture of Peter throughout. And you see that with other figures in the Gospels as well. Like even Jesus between John. A lot of times people say, well, John's Jesus is so different than the synoptics, but yet John's Jesus makes puns and is sarcastic and is witty, you know, and they have these little characteristics that are the same. Or even like Mary and Martha in the story in Luke and in the story of Mary and Martha that we see in John, there's a lot of like similar characteristics. And so I think these similar personality traits, including Peter's embarrassing personality traits, give us a unified view of the characters, which gives us a unified view of the authors. Again, that they're trying to be honest and get it right, and that they really were close up to the events that they were reporting.